Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning. For those of you that don't know me or haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name is Mick Cody, and I'm with CISL User Services. Get a few procedural things out of the way before we really get started here. And first of all, please remember to keep your Zoom audio muted throughout the presentation. That'll be helpful and courteous to everyone else. And if you have any questions, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. BJ, who's our co-host this morning, has already has one started here, but please enter your questions into there and we'll get to as many of those questions or comments as we can. So I know, looking through those of you who registered for this, I know many of you, and much of the material, especially the first part of this, will be familiar to you. Hopefully you'll learn something new or informative, or maybe some things will be cleared up for you. But there's also quite a few who registered who I believe are new to NCAR's HPC environment. Hopefully this will be a useful introduction and you'll learn something for moving forward with our storage systems. So what we're going to cover today is this is kind of the outline we'll follow. We'll start by covering the Glade file spaces, common to most that everybody will become familiar with if you're not already. We'll move on to campaign storage, the HPSS tape archive system, mostly for just a historical perspective, but I want to also emphasize the urgency of migrating any data you might have still remaining on the tapes. We'll talk briefly about collections, and then finish up with some tips, tricks, just some things you may or may not be familiar with about managing your data on our storage systems. So Glade, as you might expect or might already know, is an acronym for Globally Accessible Data Environment. It's a very high performance shared file system. Underneath the covers is GPFS or spectrum scale from IBM. It's all of Glade is available across all of CISL's HPC systems. Today that's Cheyenne, Casper, and a little known, kind of not a commonly used area, what we call the data access nodes. So the Glade spaces, those are home, scratch, work, and project. And most users' active files and data are stored in one of these spaces. And we're going to step through each one of those, talk about each one, and hopefully explain to you what they're used for, what they're good for, and how they are available to you. So starting with home, something familiar to most of you, from not just on our system, but on most. Every user has a home directory, and the full path name is, as you see there, is Glade, U, home, and your user ID. Every user has 25 gigabytes of usable storage, and I emphasize usable there. And don't be fooled by the Glade quota command. I'll talk more about that later on in the presentation. And commonly used for scripts, source code, small data sets, kind of things that you might typically keep on your desktop, on your laptops. Continuing on with home, home is backed up by CISL several times a week. It's a complete backup of your home directory. and each backup is kept for several weeks. Eventually they roll off and are deleted. If you ever, unfortunately, come into a situation where you have to recover the full backup, please contact CISL at our support website, and we can turn that around and get your home directory back recovered for you, probably within a matter of an hour or two. Another option that I don't think many people really know about or take advantage of are snapshots. A snapshot is created of your home directory several times a day, provided there have been some changes made. If let's say commonly you won't have made any changes on a weekend, so you won't see any snapshots made. It's more of an incremental change. It's very convenient if you accidentally delete or corrupt a directory or file. You can users can run the command snap ls for a list of the snapshots that are available to you. It'll provide, just like an ls-l command from that you'd run on a directory, it'll show you when it was created and the size. If you're curious more about that, you can check out this website in our documentation. So the snapshots, whereas the backups, you have to come through CISL to get that restored. The snapshots are readily available to you, and you can copy, move, and get those in a matter of minutes.
Excuse me, Mick, there is a question in the chat.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if you have that open, but...
Yes, I do. Okay, yeah, it's a good question. Let me go back up to that slide. So what's the difference between a backup and a snapshot? Okay, good question. A backup is a full backup taken of your home directory, every file, every hidden file directory, but it's only you can only get the full backup by contacting CISL. Our storage administrators will need to do that for you, and like I mentioned a few minutes ago, they can do that within, usually turn that around in a matter of an hour or so. A snapshot is, think of that as an incremental change backup. So if you change one file in a day, on a Tuesday, in your home directory, then that snapshot will only contain that one file that was changed. Okay, so one of the differences is that the snapshots are taken several times a day, but if you haven't made any changes to your files or to any of your files in your home directory, there's no snapshot taken. Gunter, let me know if that answered your question. Okay. Another important difference is that the snapshots you as a user can access directly and just copy the files back into where you want them. Okay. Thanks, Gunter. Okay, moving on. So moving on to Glade Scratch area now. Just like home, every user has a Scratch directory when they're given a user ID. And the full path name is Glade Scratch User ID. The Scratch space today, the entire Scratch space has 15 petabytes of total capacity. I believe right now we're operating at about 70–80% of utilization. Every user by default is allocated a 10 terabyte quota. Users can can request a larger temporary extension. I want to emphasize temporary there. We will ask for some justification as to how you came about why you're asking for as much as you do. And something that's important to remember is that CISL reserves the right to reduce those extensions. But that will only happen if we start running out of space. We believe we're managing the space pretty effectively right now, and we don't anticipate that happening. But in my time at NCAR, it happened once a few years ago, and it was a painful experience for everybody. So these extensions, those are a user would submit a ticket and say, I want, let's say, another 10 terabytes of space. The consultant that receives that request will respond by asking, like, how did you come about asking for that extra 10 terabytes, and how long will you need it for? And once those questions are satisfactorily answered to our satisfaction, we usually can turn that around again within a day at the most. Okay, continuing on a little bit, finishing up on Scratch. As the name implies, it's a temporary storage space. It's very good for large output files or just even small files that you don't intend to keep very long. Today, we have a 120-day purge policy, and that's based on the file's last access time. So if you have a file on Scratch space, and let's say you read it every day, it's never going to get purged. It's never going to get deleted. If you read it every month, it wouldn't be purged. Now that 120-day policy is subject to change. Over the last year or so, we have actually increased that period. About a year ago, it was at 45 days, and then we, in an effort to help users with their space and management, we've been increasing that, and we've settled on for the past several months on this 120-day policy, and that seems to be working well for most people. One thing that's very important to remember is your Scratch space is not backed up. So unfortunately, we get seems like several requests a week from people, users saying, oh, I accidentally deleted a directory. Can we recover it? And unfortunately, the answer is no. There's no backups available. Moving on to Glade Workspace. Just like with Scratch and Home, every user has a work directory. The full path name is Glade Work and your user ID. Every user has a 1 terabyte quota allocation, and it's good for active files that need longer retention period, perhaps than Scratch space or your compiled executables. A lot of people think of it as an extension to their home directory, but how you use it is entirely up to you. Unlike Scratch space, there's no purge policy in effect on Workspace. You put a file there, it's there forever, theoretically, until you delete it. But again, just like with Scratch, your Workspace is not backed up. So if it's accidentally deleted, it's gone.
Nick, this is
Yeah, I just see a couple more questions here. Does the purge policy apply to all subfolders as well? If I open a directory with many subfolders in it, will they be safe? No, the purge policy, I assume that this is about on the Scratch purge policy. The purge policy applies only to files. So if you have a directory, subdirectory with 100 files in it, and you only read one of those files or access it in some way, just one of those files over the 4-month or 120-day period, that one file will not be purged, but the other 99 files would still be subject to the purge policy. Nafish, does that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Good, thanks. Thanks, BJ, for helping me out with the question.
There's another one just before that question also.
Okay, I missed that. Let me.
Yeah, if you prefer the end to answer them, just let us know.
Sure. No, good. So the question was, is it possible to store large data, say 500 gigabytes, for more than 6 months? If yes, how can that be done? On Scratch Space and in your work directory, 500 gigabytes is certainly possible. A 500 gigabyte file is certainly doable as far as storing. And now for more than 6 months, provided it is being, I'll say, actively used, being read occasionally, or maybe copied, if that file is copied from your Scratch Space to another area, then that will, again, that file will not be purged. If you have, in this case, any file of any size that you want to preserve for more than the 120-day that's available on Scratch, my recommendation would be to put that either in your workspace if you have enough room left, or consider putting it, copying it to campaign storage. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. We'll be getting to that. So I'm hoping that answered the question. I think I maybe stumbled through that a little bit, but please let us know if I need to elaborate or on that anymore. Okay, wait. Okay, sounds like it. Okay. So Glade Project Space. Unlike Home, Scratch, and Workspace directories that are all provided to individual users, so there's a home, each user has a home, Scratch, and Workspace. Glade Project Space is allocated and divided up on the basis of projects. And each NCAR lab has a high-level directory. There's examples here. I think I missed it. It wasn't intended to be exhaustive there. But the high-level directories are Glade P lab name. Many, but not all, university projects have a high-level directory as well. Glade P UNIV/project name, or Glade P University of Wyoming project name. And both the NCAR labs and the universities determine their organization's substructure. So what each one of these directories look like underneath can vary from, and will vary from one lab, one university to another. There are no default quotas, unlike there are with Home, Scratch, and Work. CISL User Services manages those allocations. In particular, our boss, BJ and I's boss, Dave Hart, is responsible for those allocations. And NCAR labs and the universities are responsible for managing their usage. It used to be that CISL was more involved with how the project space got used, but we've backed off of that as in the last several years, and how the space is used is up to the individual labs. There is no purge policy in place. Files can stay there theoretically forever, but again, just like with the work and scratch spaces, they're not backed up. When I say high level, I meant someone asked what I meant by high level. If I go up a little bit. So in this sense, Glade/P would be a high level directory. And then there are subdirectories underneath CISL, HAO, ACOM, so forth. Okay, and not backed up. Okay, so that's all for Glade. I'll pause here for a moment and see if there's any, before we move on to Campaign Store, see if there's any last questions about any of the Glade spaces. Someone asked, is the home space purged? No, no. It's home and project space are not purged. Thanks for asking. About Glade quota, I'll get to that when we come to managing into the final sections. Okay. And then how can we request space for our project? That is a request depending on whether you're you're a member of an NCAR lab or a university. For universities, that is part of the project request process. I believe it's called CHAP. And at that point, it's the responsibility of the project lead to make that part of the project request. That would come along with when you were requesting core hours on Cheyenne or Casper or space and campaign storage. Okay. Okay. So moving on to campaign storage. Those of you who've been here a user of our systems for about a year or so know that this is a relatively new storage space. It's a very cost-effective but medium performance disk-based file system. We refer to it as a warm archive for storing data on what are normal publication timescales, approximately 5 years. It's available as a Globus endpoint, and in fact, when campaign storage was first deployed, the only way users could access it was through Globus. The endpoint name is, as you see here, is NCAR campaign storage. Simple enough. But today, it's also available directly as a POSIX-mounted file system on Casper and the data access nodes. It's simply mounted as Glade/campaign. Yes, but I may want to emphasize it's not available from Cheyenne, either Cheyenne's login nodes or the batch or compute nodes. If you want to use data that on campaign storage, if you want to use that on Cheyenne, you need to copy it to one of the other mounted file systems. Your most likely Scratch, but it could be or project space as well. This slide just was updated about 30 minutes ago for everybody's information. As of yesterday, literally yesterday, the total capacity of campaign storage is 43 petabytes. Current users are currently using over 21 petabytes of data, so we're at about 48% full. We have more than 365 active users, on individual users on the system. And CISL plans to annually increase the size of that, of campaign storage, depending on our budgets, available budget, and its utilization. Early on, when campaign storage was first deployed, not surprisingly, the uptake and usage of it was a bit on the slow or low side, and we were concerned about that. But with the end of life for HPSS and making campaign storage available by through basic POSIX access on Casper and the data access nodes, utilization has increased steadily. I'll show you a graph here in a minute on that. The reason this next line on the first augmentation is lined out, scratched out, was that as of up until yesterday, we didn't know exactly when the new augmentation was going to become available. But the storage administrators worked very hard to get this online very quickly, and it's now part of the system. Something that's we're very happy to announce too is that the second augmentation, which normally would have been planned for next year, has already been approved by the NSF, and we expect that will be deployed and available later this summer. It's expected to be on an increase of 24 petabytes. Think of campaign storage as almost a mirror of Glade project space. Just like in project space, each lab and many university projects have a directory allocated for them. The organizations underneath them are very similar to the Glade's project space. There are no default quotas. CISL manages those, how much is allocated, just like they do with the project space that we talked about a few minutes ago. And just like project space, and the labs and universities are responsible for managing their usage. And what I mean by that is that we don't try and tell or impose any limits on how much any one user can use. There's no individual quotas on that. There is currently a 5-year purge policy, and that's based on when a file was created. So what that means in today's the way the policy is written is that at the 5-year anniversary of when a file was created, it would be purged. I will tell you that CISL is seriously reconsidering that policy. We're still about almost 2 years away from when the oldest files would be, or 3 years from when the oldest files would be getting close to that date. So there's no, I wouldn't worry, I'm encouraging you, don't worry about that right now, and we will keep users apprised of any changes to that policy. Just like with project space and the others, there are no backups of any of the files or directories in campaign storage. Here's the graph I mentioned a few minutes ago. You can see I haven't even had time to fully update this. If you look at the capacity line, that jumped up by 17 petabytes yesterday. The rest of the numbers are all very close. We've got about 21 petabytes of usage, over 220 million files are stored on there, and about 35 petabytes have been allocated. That's what I mean by the quota. Yes. The sharp jump you see about last July, shortly before last July 1st, that was when CISL increased out the quotas for all users, and you could see a sharp jump in that on one day. Okay, I think I'll pause here. Let's see. So one good question here, a couple of them here actually, is campaign storage all disk or does it utilize tape as well? It's all disk. It's in fact at the very close to the hardware level, it's a cousin of the Glade system. And another question, good one, if the 5-year policy continues, will users get an alert when files are about to, it is our intention to alert all users on that. I am going to address some of this later on when we talk about managing data and some of the tools that are available to users. Is the 5-year purge policy of campaign consistent with journal requirements? We believe it is, Betty. That was really the basis for setting the 5-year policy. My understanding is that some journal requirements, they're not all 5 years across the board, but we tried to hit what we thought was a good medium for that. And let's see. I think there was another question. And someone asked, is campaign storage a reasonable substitute for HPSS? Yes, we believe that's really was one of the primary motivations of creating the campaign storage space to begin with, was to encourage users to migrate off of tape, which is more expensive. We'll get to that here in a minute. And I mentioned at the beginning of the campaign storage piece that it was a cost-effective, medium performance file space. It's much easier and cost-effective for CISL to increase the capacity of campaign storage than it is HPSS. So we strongly encourage people to consider campaign storage as a substitute for HPSS. So moving on to HPSS, speaking of which, again, I'm only mentioning this now, not to give some of the participants here this morning a bit of a perspective on where it came from, what we're talking about here, because you probably have heard a lot about it. You see a lot of notifications from us in the daily bulletin about migrating data off of there. So a quick bit of history here. It's tape. Was intended as a cold archive for long-term data storage, but it's now in what we call its end-of-life stage, and it will be decommissioned on October 1st, 2021. The reason it had to be put into this end-of-life phase was that it's become technically and financially unsustainable. The manufacturers of tapes have stopped producing tapes, and in fact they're embroiled in lawsuits back and forth and holding up production of any more for a while. It became read-only earlier this year, as most of you became somewhat painfully aware of. Again, here's just the question. It's been we consider it as a functional replacement. Its functional replacement is campaign storage. We're actively working with users to vacate the HPSS. When we started that effort, there was more than 90 petabytes of data and over 300 million files stored on HPSS, some of which had not been touched in 15, 16 years or more. So again, to re-emphasize, the system will be shut down, closed off on October 1st, 2021. So that's still more than 17 months away. And so there's plenty of time to migrate your data, right? Nope, there really isn't. And the reason is much technical as it is anything else. We still have about 80 petabytes of data remaining on the system. We estimate that a good but aggressive estimate for the amount of data that could be read off the tape systems and then read and then eventually copied someplace else is about 2 petabytes a month. So that means as of today, only about 42% of the data of those 80 petabytes can still be read before October 1st, 2021. So maybe put that in a little bit more perspective. If the 80 petabytes still remains 1 year away from the shutdown date, only 30% of the data will be able to be read. And if for that, if we wait till looking at 6 months out from the shutdown date, only 15% will be able to be read. What we're very concerned about and why you receive emails from me or Davide Delvento in our group and you see all the notices in the daily bulletin is that we're very concerned that there'll be too many users will wait to the last minute or wait until, not maybe the last minute, but wait until it's too late to get their data off of there. So please begin, if you haven't already, please begin migrating your data to other storage spaces as soon as possible. Okay, any questions about HPSS at this before I move on to collections? There is one. Will HPSS be replaced with another long-term archive, or is campaign storage the only alternative? Good question. For the vast majority of users, campaign storage is the only alternative. There is another tape system being procured, designed and procured by CISL, but access to it is going to be very limited to a very small number of projects and not even projects, efforts. Things like AMPS, RDA, EOL data. So some of the critical, and that didn't mean that to be an exhaustive list of those, but for most users, the vast majority of users, the new tape system will not be available. And that's why I didn't bother mentioning it today, because it's not a viable alternative for most of you. Okay. Okay, I'll get to those about the NSF grants at the end of, I'll hold off on those until the end, okay, for the two that have asked about that. So collections, I think this kind of ties in with my comments here a few minutes ago about the new tape system, but I wanted to mention it for the sake of completeness today. It is reserved for a very small number of permanent collections. It's mounted as you see here, as /Glade/collections. It's curated, it's intended for curated research data. Again, RDA, the Climate Data Gateway, CNIP AP, EOL and HAO are probably the primary ones. I believe that the aviation group also has an allocation in collections. It's available by special request only, and CISL's User Services, again, Dave Hart manages those requests. So that really completes everything I wanted to say about the spaces themselves. And now I want to move on to managing your data, but I think this would probably be a good time to answer those previous questions about, do you need an active NSF grant to apply for project or campaign store? I believe the answer to that is yes. The final say on that is Dave Hart, but I believe that that is correct. There are, wait, let me retract part of that. There are small project grants that are available that can request space on both of those systems. So, so managing your data, and maybe this is what many of you, many of you are here today. So I want to talk first about some tools, some commands that are readily available to all users. And then we'll talk a little that are available for you to use today to manage your data today. And then I also want an important to cover the DASH and DSET programs efforts in CISL that for looking for beyond the here and now. So managing your data, it's surprising with the number of questions that we get in the consulting group about that, how many users aren't even aware of the Glade quota command. It's a quick and easy to use. It's maintained by CISL, both the command and the underlying database that that it reports on. The Glade spaces are updated. I'll show you an example here in the next slide. The Glade spaces, the information on them, your home, scratch, work, project are all updated almost real time. Campaign storage is updated every hour. And it returns what I think, or what we believe is important information on your storage spaces that you have access to write to. One word of caution here for users that catches us and users by surprise a lot is that if you reach the limit of your quotas on any of your Glade spaces, you may find yourself experiencing some weird problems, like you can't log on to systems all of a sudden. Your jobs that used to run like clockwork start failing. This is particularly true if your home space fills up or your scratch directories fill up. And that's because a lot of jobs write their temporary data to scratch. So you can run the Glade quota. What I recommend is that you run the Glade quota somewhat regularly or routinely to check your usage. So simply just run the command, simple Glade quota, and it'll report on your space. And this is what it looks like. Mine's very, very simple. I don't have a lot of access to a lot of spaces out there. I do want to point out here this that Glade quota will report that you have 50 gigabytes of space in your home directory. And as I pointed out early in the one of the first slides, is that's not true. You only have 25 gigabytes of usable space. Why does this report 50? Well, that's because of the backups that are made, that CISL makes. Underneath the covers, you do have 50 gigabytes, but half of that is reserved for the backups. So that's the explanation for that. I think that's probably enough on that. Okay, another tool or set of information that's available to everyone that a lot of people don't know about is the access report.txt files. These are files that the storage administrators provide for the Glade project space and campaign storage. And it provides a quick look at not just the data usage, but the access trends. So you can, I'll show you an example here in just a minute in the next slide, but they report on not only on who's been using the data and how frequently it has been accessed. So it's frequently used by the lab and university data managers. For example, in CGD, Gary Strand looks at this. In ACOM, it's Garth Dalto. So I don't want to try and list all of those, but although they use this, they tell me regularly, all users have access to it, if you have access to the directories that they're reporting on. So, for example, my group, consulting services group, you see this, if we just examine the contents of the access report.txt file, it shows what I think you could think of as a textual histogram of how when the data has been accessed. This shows that in this case 2.32 gigabytes has been accessed in less than a month, and then so forth. Within 6 months it was 62 megabytes, so forth and so on. Underneath that, in the next section, we see who those users were in my group who were actually using and reading the data. This gets continued on the next. This is just the first page of this report. The rest of it looks like this. As you saw, there wasn't anything in the 1 month time period. Then there's, but then within the 6 month time period, there were these users: CSG team, Davide, Brian Vanderwende, and Dick Valent had accessed this amount of data in the previous 6 months. So I used my team as an example because we're a pretty light user of project space, as you can see. Nothing compared to some of the heavier users in the labs. Okay, yeah. So I also alluded to this earlier, but not specifically by name. CISL recently deployed a new tool called Goofy, kind of a funny name with maps back to an acronym of Grand Unified File Index. It was developed here in the last couple of years at Los Alamos, and it provides just amazingly fast queries of massive file systems. It was designed specifically for this. Probably not surprised to know that NCAR is not the only lab or business interest out there in the world that has a problem with managing large amounts of data. For more full document, I'm not here to give a tutorial on Goofy. That's out of my realm of expertise. But if you're interested in knowing more about it, this link here has a lot more information. Now, CISL updates the Goofy database every weekend, and it covers all the Glade spaces that we've talked about earlier today, campaign storage, and HPSS. In fact, CISL is probably now the biggest user of Goofy right now, because we're using it to generate those weekly HPSS user and project file lists that many of you have received emails from me about. The updates run like on Sunday, and those files are updated on Monday. Users, you're welcome, if you're brave enough, you can write your own SQL-like queries to the Goofy database, and the documentation I pointed to on the previous slide has plenty of help and examples on that. But CISL provides some easy-to-use query, what we call wrapper scripts. In fact, Sid Gosh have wrote these, and they're available for the most part today. It simplifies many of the common user queries, saves users from having to learn the kind of the goofy specific SQL commands. They're available on Casper, but not Cheyenne. And these wrapper scripts are currently being evaluated by the NCAR Storage Advisors Group. But you're welcome, if you're interested, please contact me or anyone in my group, and we can help you with that, particularly Sid. There's really just a two-step process. Simple command QDH, which stands for Query Data Holdings. Yeah, Query Data Holdings. And what that does is you provide it with some parameters. I'll show you an example here in the next slide. And that generates behind the scenes the well-formed query to the Goofy server. And then it stores the output files by default in your Scratch directory. There's a second step, QDH plot, that we intend that it will be designed to give you a graphical picture of the data holdings based on the parameters that you gave it in the QDH command. And the reason for that QDH plot is because the contents of the text files that are generated aren't really human readable, but we'll get to that in a minute. So to run the wrapper script, you simply log on to Casper. You load the Goofy wrappers module, as you see here, and then run the command QDH with the appropriate parameters and options. We're not going to get into all the details of those parameters and options, but here today, again, we've got documentation on that in the link that you see at the bottom of this slide. When it becomes available, and Sid tells me it'll be probably about 2 weeks, the QDH plot will be available as well. And when those are ready, we will announce that in the daily bulletin when it's ready. So here's a very simple Goofy example using my very modest holdings on campaign storage. You see, first step was to load the Goofy wrappers module, and then I ran the command QDH with these parameters you see here. What I'm asking for here is to list the file name, size, and owner. See that towards that I own. And then the rest is the output from the command in terms of what you see on your terminal. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the first set of outputs in that .dat files is not really readable by most of us. You're welcome to look at it. It is text files, ASCII files, so you can look at it, but you wouldn't get much out of it. Then it writes the output file in the set of output files in your Scratch directory, in the directory you see there, and reports .dat. And then it closes the connection to the server, which, by the way, Squall is the name of the Goofy server, if you're curious about that. So again, if you're at all interested in this Goofy tool, I would encourage you to wait a couple of weeks for the Goofy plot tool to become available, and I think it'll be, your experience will be much more satisfying at that point. Here's looking at the contents of that .dat file that I mentioned. You can see that it's not terribly interesting or useful. What it's showing there is the name of the files, the size of the files, and who owns them, which in this case is me. And so, but don't worry, the plot is on the way. And again, please remember that this is a very, very simple example. My holdings on campaign storage are tiny compared to many of you. Okay, let's move on to dash and dset. Nan asked questions, how the file usage reports are created. They are automatic, Nan. I think they're created at least weekly by the CISL storage administrators. So there's nothing for you to do except read them, actually, really. Does it show if people outside the group accessed our direct? Yes, there was also a question, does the access reports show if people outside the group? Yes, it shows anyone who accessed any of the data, the files in your in that project or campaign storage space. Now, to be honest, I don't know if someone that does not have access to let's say a project space directory tries to read it, that probably would not get registered because they wouldn't have been, it wouldn't have been a successful read attempt. And yeah. So BJ just warned me that we're running a little long, so I'll try and wrap up here as quickly as I can. But I'll try and get to the questions afterwards, and you can, everyone is welcome to hang on then. So remember at the beginning of this section, I said that the first part of this was going to be devoted to or focused on tools that you could use today. I want to say a few words about planning ahead and looking ahead to tomorrow. And for that, we encourage users to take advantage of the dash and dset teams that are available to you in the CISL community, CISL family. I think the important thing on this slide is the last bullet. That's a UCAR policy now, that project PIs must engage dash during the initial planning and budgeting phase of their projects. This is to plan. So my point here is, if you believe that your project is going to generate data of lasting value, it's important that you engage with these teams to find out what you need to do at the beginning. The bottom line is plan ahead and don't wait to the last minute to or wait till the end, not the last minute, but wait till near the end of the project. Say, okay, now what am I going to do with all this data? Where is it going to go? The time to do that is at the beginning of the project, if possible, or starting tomorrow, if you can. And the principals there are Doug Schuster, who many of you know. He manages the CISL DEX group, which where RDA is managed out of. Bridget Thasher is the DASH coordinator, and Matt Manick is the DSET chair. And they're more than all of these folks are great to work with, and will be willing to, glad to help you out with any of the questions you may have. So I'm done with that. Let's get back to some of the questions. Again, I know we're running a little long now. If you have to leave, I certainly understand, but I'll stay on and answer as many questions as I can. So, So Kurt asked, Glade quota tells me that my home directory has 50 gigabytes total and is 82% full. Am I right that the amount of storage actually available is 18%? Yes, that is, you're correct, Kurt. Your arithmetic is correct on that. What was the advice for storing simulations for longer than 5 years? I have examples of simulations that I ran about 8 years ago where people still ask for the data. Is project space the only options for cases like this within CISL storage systems? Isla, that good question, and I think this last piece that I just talked about as far as working with Dash and DSET would be what I would consider your best option, but campaign storage is, again, we're looking, I don't want to give false hopes, but we are looking at hard at the 5-year retention period from create date. And I think either Bridget or Matt, Doug, that I mentioned in the previous slide would be your best option, or they would be the people I would recommend that you talk to in contact about that. It's not CISL's intention. In fact, it's the last thing we want to do is for anybody to lose any data, much less valuable data. So please check with them and get more of an official take on what they recommend. Okay. Let's see. I'm surprised you did not talk about possible charging for storage. Gokhan, that's a good question. That really never even occurred to me. There are options for that. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis. I can look at augmenting these slides for that. It's not common. I know that, for example, CGD bought, maybe this is what Gokhan is referring to, actually purchased their own storage space within campaign storage. It's not available, obviously, it's not available to the general user community, but that is an option if not for project space or any of the other Glade spaces, but for campaign storage in particular. If a lab feels like they need more than what CISL can provide within our budgets, there is an option, there is an avenue for purchasing additional storage for exclusive use by your lab. Yeah. Gokhan, I don't know if that addresses what you were looking for or not. Let's see, looking back through some of the other questions that were earlier. His name. I think I've got all the questions. I'm glad to hang on here for, here's a, store. For the Cheyenne user, how can we store our simulation results more than 1 terabyte during the publication period? There your option would be either on the 1 terabyte quota is specifically for your workspace. You're very likely you have more space than that available to you on Scratch, although that's the Purge Policy there probably interferes with your publication period. Then I would suggest, or your best option is campaign storage for things larger than 1 terabyte. Yeah, and then that would depend on what your lab or university's or your project's allocation provides, though. So without knowing more, about the particulars on your project, that's probably the best I can do as far as answering your question. Nan asked, would the additional campaign storage space be managed by CISL? Yes, yeah. Including restricting access to only those who have who are authorized for it. Okay, looks like the number of questions are slowing down. I don't know how many people we have left in the session here. My email address is was at the beginning on the first slide of this presentation. Simply, if you have any more questions to think of later, it's simply mickc @ucar.edu. I'll be glad to try and answer as many of those as I can later.